Jansen, and I'm with the Academy of Science St. Louis, and we are very pleased to partner with the St. Louis Zoo to bring you conservation conversations. Many of you are Academy members and friends, and for those of you who are not, I'm going to take just a moment to tell you a bit about who we are and to mention a couple additional upcoming public science seminars that you might have an interest in attending. The Academy is a local nonprofit. We've been serving the St. Louis community and surrounding counties since 1856, and we have a very long-standing mission to advance the public understanding of science and inspire the next generation of scientists and science advocates. And we do that through a broad range of free and low-cost public science programming, collaborative seminar series, and trips and tours that highlight science throughout the region. You can find more information on us and our community-wide events and programs by visiting our website at academyofscience.stl.org. You may also visit us on Facebook or Twitter, or pick up some of our literature that's just outside the auditorium at the visitor's desk on your way out. It may not have been here when you arrived here tonight, but it is out there now. If you would like to receive e-notification of upcoming Academy and St. Louis Zoo public lectures and events, there are some e-news sign-up sheets that'll make their way around the audience. There's one outside the auditorium as well. We'll also have stickers that will be available at the visitor's desk following tonight's talk for any students who need to verify their attendance. And then just very briefly, some upcoming Academy public partnership events that you might also have an interest in attending. On Tuesday evening, March 1st, 7 p.m. at Kirkwood High School in the Keating Theater Auditorium, and as part of our Pioneering Science Seminar Series, Dr. Joel Birkin, Professor of Civil, Architectural, and Environmental Engineering at Missouri S&T, talks about Mother Nature's expert witness, phytoforensics, how plants collect evidence of environmental pollution. The talk is free and open to the public, and students and teachers are encouraged to attend. On Wednesday evening, March 2, at 7:30 p.m. here in the Living World Auditorium, Dr. Dan Cheras, founder and director of the Evergreen Institute, president of Sustainable Systems Design, Inc., and nationally known author of more than 24 books on green building, residential renewable energy, and sustainability, talks about re-energizing America, renewable energy solutions for the future as part of our science seminar series partnership with the St. Louis Zoo. There will be books available for signing and purchase following the talk. And then finally, on Friday, March 11, as part of our On Science seminar series with Oasis St. Louis, Dr. Richard Hausman, who is an associate professor of entomology with the Division of Plant Sciences at the University of Missouri-Columbia, will be at the center of Clayton from 1 to 2:30 p.m. to talk about bed bugs, getting reacquainted with an old antagonist, and you do need to RSVP for this event, and you can do so by calling 314-533-8586 or by emailing rsvp@academyofscience.stl.org. And again, you can find more information on these and additional upcoming science opportunities on our website or in some of the literature we've left for you to take with you before you leave this evening. So with all of that said, I'm going to introduce Louise Bradshaw, who is the education director at the St. Louis Zoo. Louise?
Thank you, Rose. I was looking back through some files and I realized that our relationship, the zoo's relationship with the Academy of Science and putting on various different speaker series is, Rose, I don't know, 20 years old? I think so. So this has been a very successful partnership with us. We're really pleased to be able to bring fabulous speakers talking about really important conservation issues to you. I do want to bring up a couple of talks that did not make our regular series. They've kind of popped up more recently. One is on March 29th. We're going to have Paul Nelson, who's with the U.S. Forest Service. He works in the Mark Twain National Forest here in Missouri. He's very interested and has done a lot of research on the use of fire as a management tool for prairies. It's actually a very controversial management tool. So he'll be doing a presentation here on March 29th, and we'll have more information that'll go out via the Academy or via the zoo. And then we also have another speaker, potentially, who will be talking in early March about Brazil and who works with the Conservation International in the Brazil program and the carbon sequestration that Brazil is doing to help preserve their forests. So, speakers like this, various different topics are out there. We're working hard to make sure we bring them to you. So I would like to now, we're going to do a little passing of the I think, microphone here. To introduce our speaker, I'd like to introduce Stephanie Braccini. Stephanie is the zoological manager of our Great Ape program here at the St. Louis Zoo. Stephanie.
I'm going to actually pass the microphone. I first met Crickette back, I actually looked it up, at 2007 at the Mind of the Chimpanzee conference. She was giving a great talk about honey pounding in chimpanzees. And as a bright-eyed graduate student, I decided I was going to stump her with my question on hand preference. Waited my turn to talk to her, in which she had a ready answer. Went, oh, of course we've looked at that. So, little did I know it would lead to further collaborations, and Crickette has been a fantastic collaborator, researcher, and a mentor to me in the time that I've been here. As an assistant professor in the anthropology department at Washington University in St. Louis, Crickette's research focuses on understanding the factors which have led to the emergence. That wasn't me. And promoted the maintenance of behavioral diversity in primates, focusing mainly on social organization and material culture that has been documented among wild chimpanzee populations. As co-principal investigator of the Goualougo Triangle Ape Project in Northern Republic of Congo, Crickette, Sanz, and David Morgan conduct field studies to examine the behavioral ecology of chimpanzees, the social and ecological factors shaping their complex tool use traditions, including hand preference, and the effects of human disturbance on chimpanzees and gorillas. This research fits in well with the overall goal to promote the long-term conservation of both chimpanzees and gorillas through applied conservation research, enhance protection of important ape populations and their habitats, and strengthening the local capacity to implement conservation programs. You can find Crickette's numerous publications in the American Journal of Primatology, International Journal of Primatology, Journal of Human Evolution, Biology Letters, and of course, the February 2010 edition of National Geographic. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Crickette Sanz.
Stephanie, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you all so much for coming out and sharing this evening with me. I do apologize for the microphone screech. This will just go to prove that the chimpanzees that I study are more adept tool users than I am. The talk here this evening is called Congo's Curious Chimpanzees, and I hope that you'll see throughout the presentation why we consider them to be curious, and also we'll talk about their tool-using behaviors and end the presentation with the context of conservation that these chimpanzees face and the plight for continuing their traditions in these forests. I'd also like to mention that this was originally going to be a presentation with my co-presenter and principal investigator of the Goualougo Triangle Chimpanzee Project, also my husband, David Morgan, but he's traveling back from Congo as we speak and will be arriving here just on Saturday. So he's with us in spirit, and you will definitely see some pictures because I can use those without him being present, some of the ones that I've dug up from the past. So without further ado, I'd like to take you to the Congo Basin in Central Africa. And this is an area of incredible biodiversity. We have dense lowland forests that harbor over 10,000 plant species. We have 1,000 bird species and over 400 mammal species. Elusive wildlife surrounds you. You can't always see it because the forests are so thick and dense, but definitely we have amazing creatures like this bongo, flagship species like the forest elephant, and we have one of the world's foremost researchers of forest elephants here in the room, actually a mentor of ours. And the first person I met when I flew to the Congo Basin and arrived in Gabon, actually Dr. Steve Blake, who is here and covering his face. But it's a true honor to be giving this presentation more than a decade after meeting him in Central Africa and having him bail me out in the airport and get me to a hotel. So thank you, Steve. This is the result of your work as well. We also have western lowland gorillas in these forests. These are different than the mountain gorillas that Diane Fossey studied in the Karasoke area. These western lowland gorillas weren't very well known until less than a decade ago, and they move into these open clearings within this dense forest and feed on different types of herbaceous vegetation. And so we're learning about these animals in the Congo Basin and central chimpanzees. This is a subspecies of chimpanzee that's different than the eastern and western chimpanzee, and there's not much known about their social behavior and complexity. And the reason for this is there were no long-term study sites devoted to the study of this taxa until the Goualougo Triangle Chimpanzee Project, which is the project that I'm going to be sharing with you this evening. So the long-term research of Jane Goodall, Toshida Nishida, Richard Wrangham, Vernon Reynolds, had all taken place in the eastern extent of their range. And indeed, we have studied chimpanzees in that region for more than 50 years. The 50-year anniversary of Gombe was just this past year. Also in the West Coast, Christophe Bosch and the Japanese research teams have established study sites in West Africa to study the western subspecies since the late 1970s. But there's a huge expanse of forest in the Congo Basin that I just mentioned, where there haven't been long-term studies of chimpanzees. And this is intriguing to someone interested in the behavioral diversity of this taxa, because we know chimpanzees in the east and the west differ so dramatically. Chimpanzees in the east use tools to gather termites. Chimpanzees in the west use nuts or hammers to crack open nuts, hammers and anvils. We see chimpanzees in the east having very strong male bonds, but not so strong female bonds. But in the west, it's different. We see females that have very strong social bonds and form long friendships, different types of society, if you will. And so what would be discovered in Central Africa if a long-term study site were to be established? This is something that my husband and I wanted to pursue, and so we wanted to work in this particular area, focusing on Northern Republic of Congo. And I wanted to tell a bit about how we got there, because there's a connection with a zoological park. And I said I could show some pictures of David because he's not here and he can't restrain me from doing that. He worked at Busch Gardens and in Tampa, Florida for many years, hoping to get out into the field and study wild chimpanzees and gorillas. He worked in the education department, he worked in the primate house, he worked with the great apes, any opportunity that he could get to work with animals and hopefully be able to continue and follow his dream into the wilds of Africa, specifically wanting to work in Central Africa because he'd seen a National Geographic that featured the work of this individual who some of you in this room know, Dr. Michael Fay, who actually received his Ph.D. at Washington University here in St. Louis. Michael Fay was visiting a zoological park in Tampa, Florida, Busch Gardens, and had a similar type of presentation, a conservation conversation, if you will, presenting his research in the Nouabalé-Ndoki National Park. And a young zookeeper who was working with the gorillas at that time went to attend and expressed his interest in wanting to go work with apes in Central Africa. So off he goes to Central Africa, to the Republic of Congo. And when you arrive in this country, you fly into a city, Brazzaville. You take a domestic flight to the northern portion of the country, to the northern population center, which is Weso. I think that's where David is right now on his way down to Brazzaville, but unfortunately this domestic flight isn't working right now, so he has to take a bus. And that will be a long, treacherous journey, and that's why his voyage is delayed, unfortunately. From Weso, you take a dugout canoe for approximately 5 or 6 hours on one of the most beautiful rivers in the world. I think the stars are just pressing down on you at night as you're traveling up the river. And there's really no villages. It's just continuous forest cover, as you can see from this satellite image. The lush green vegetation of that lowland forest and all of those different plants and bird and mammal species surrounding you on both sides of the river, until you arrive at the Nouabalé-Ndoki National Park headquarters, which is in Bomassa. And then from Bomassa, to get out to our field site, you follow a small logging road for about an hour. You take a dugout canoe that you can barely just fit yourself and your bags into for an hour or so, and then you backpack your gear in another 5 hours to get to our headquarters for the Goualougo Triangle Base Camp. So again, here's the Republic of Congo, which we just saw the video, or the voyage, that's located in the Northern Republic of Congo, and our field site is located in the southern portion of the national park. It's this red appendix you can see at the bottom of the national park. And this was actually not originally a part of the national park when David Morgan was recruited by Mike Fay to work in this region. It was in the logging concession. But there had been different stories, local folklore, about the wildlife in this area responding as if they had never seen humans before. And so it was thought that going into these areas and studying some of these animals could be used to gather information to lobby for the protection of these unique forests. And so this was one of the mandates of David Morgan and myself going into this area more than a decade ago. And indeed, the chimpanzees lived up to their reputation. When we arrived in these forests, and David had come back from his first pilot mission and described, following up on the stories of Steve Blake, who had also done surveys in this region, about chimpanzees that when they saw you, they didn't run away. And when you go to habituate chimpanzees in most other forests, they would run away because they had potentially been hunted or antagonized by humans. But in this particular area, the chimpanzees seemed curious. They would actually approach closer to you. They would come to the ground and they threw sticks at us sometimes. Instead of the number of individuals decreasing when you contacted them, they would vocalize and call in their friends, and group sizes would actually increase. Specific behaviors of individuals were that they would lean forward and take a closer look. They were very interested, and these contacts didn't just last a few minutes. I remember during the first visits, they could be up to 6 or 7 hours long, and we could observe some of their social interactions just during those first contacts. Chimpanzees are very difficult to habituate to humans in other places, sometimes taking up to 10 or 12 years. So here we thought we had a real advantage and also this unique behavior to document so that we could lobby for the protection of these forests. And with the protection of the chimpanzees, you would also protect potentially the gorillas, the elephants, all of the other biodiversity in this wonderful 400 square kilometer area. I mentioned the gorillas that live in this area, and I think sometimes people don't have an impression of exactly how close the gorillas are to the chimpanzees in some of these contexts, and that's because it hasn't been studied in a lot of areas in Central Africa. There is overlap between chimpanzees and gorillas, but not places where you can observe them at the same time. The gorillas were also naive to human presence. They're a little bit more shy of being observed, but we were still able to make observations of them, sometimes in the same canopy. So here you can see a chimpanzee on the left and a silverback gorilla on the right. So we arrived at this particular fig tree, had heard chimpanzee vocalizations, and we're looking up into the canopy counting, okay, chimpanzee, chimpanzee, okay, we know this chimpanzee, this is Maya, and these are her 2 children. Talangai is there, feeding on figs. What is that ginormous ape sitting next to them? Twice as large as a chimpanzee, it's a silverback gorilla. And he stayed for many hours, built a nest, chest-beated at us, but continued to feed in close proximity to the chimpanzees, not having any conflicts with them over fruits, not showing any friendly interactions, just going about their business, feeding on figs and enjoying their day in a forest in Northern Republic of Congo. So to take you in a little bit closer to the area where we work and explain some of our study design and move on to some of our research findings more specifically, I would like to show you this map of the Goualougo Triangle. So the actual Goualougo Triangle is formed by these 2 rivers. So here we have the Goualougo River moving down to the confluence with the Ndoki, then moving back up into the park. And this area is that appendix we saw in the previous map, the area that hung below the Nouabalé-Ndoki National Park that we were lobbying for the annexation of. And in 2003, after the reports of the chimpanzee densities, their behaviors being naive, and so on and so forth, the government of the Republic of Congo agreed to annex this area to the national park. And this was thrilling news. We were very excited because this would be the safe haven for these chimpanzees and other wildlife. But we quickly realized that chimpanzees residing just on the other side of the river, just as naive, enjoying their forests as the chimpanzees where we were studying them, were not going to be as fortunate because the line on the map was simply excluding them. And so we realized we needed to broaden our study area into that logging zone to examine the effects of logging on those chimpanzees and other wildlife and try to develop strategies to mitigate the effects of logging and other human encroachment in the area. So these lines don't actually occur in the forest. They're lines that we walk within the forest to count the number of chimpanzees that reside in those areas. And you can't usually go in and count each individual chimpanzee. That would be much too labor intensive. You count their nests. So the nests they build at night, their sleeping platforms. So every 6 months we walk along these lines and we count how many chimpanzee and gorilla nests we encounter. And we can determine if numbers are increasing or decreasing or if they're moving away from certain threats or moving closer to other food sources and so on and so forth. And this will be important in a graph I show a little bit later on. So this area here in the red is within the logging zone, and also zone C here on the left side of the river is in the logging zone. And we have the pressures of logging coming in from both the east and the west on the main study area where we have our base camp. And I'm going to show you a picture of the base camp in a moment that is located where this red star is. So that's home sweet home. It's super plush, right? We had one of the foremost researchers of wild chimpanzees come to visit us. Well, we had Jane Goodall as well, but also Christoph Busch. And he came and he said, well, this is rustic. This is old school primatology. We don't want to have a huge impact on the forest. Obviously, that's what we're trying to avoid. So this is a natural tree fall clearing. We cut up the tree that had fallen and we made platforms for tents and screened tent areas as an office. So this is our office here in the center with a tarp, because we quickly realized if you just put up a tent, it gets wet and everything inside gets wet, so it's nice to put up a tarp over the top of it. And behind that is our kitchen area. We have just an open wood burning fire where we heat water and cook our food. And then you can see the workers' tents back here, and our tents are a little bit further back in the forest. As I mentioned, David Morgan and I are the principal investigators of the study. David actually founded the study in 1999 and pursued his Ph.D. at Cambridge University, and I am a graduate of Washington University here in St. Louis, and I'm very, very happy to be back. We are so fortunate to work with a very dedicated team, and one of the most important players in that team is Jean-Robert Onanonga. He has been working in conservation for over 14 years, not just in northern Congo, but also in a southern area of the country, in the Crickette National Park. And he is the person that has walked all those surveys in the forest, counting nests, when David and I were more interested in chasing after the actual chimpanzees and being able to observe their behavior. He trudged through this area, which isn't a very impressive swamp, but still, he did walk through many swamps counting chimpanzee and gorilla nests day after day, year after year, and now he is managing our project in the field when we can't be there. Also, we have recruited a botanist who is a student of Marion and Ngouabi University at the time. He just received his undergraduate degree, but showed great talent and promise in the area of botany. And he has recently just completed his master's degree at the University of Edinburgh. And I'm very proud that a botanist from the Missouri Botanical Garden is here, because he realizes that when I was a graduate student at Washington University and looking for any information about botany I could find, that I was hopeless. And we would probably need expert help. And so we're very fortunate to have the staff botanist, Sidney Ndolo, who's returned from getting his master's and now a major part of our team. Also, Crépin Ayana, who's been working with us for the past 7 years. He's a graduate of Marion and Ngouabi University as well. His next step as far as training, beyond doing all the field work that he's been doing for several years, is to learn English and potentially pursue a master's degree in primate conservation. And those guys are great at leading teams, graduates of Marion and Ngouabi University, but most of them had never spent much time in the forest at all. They lived in the south of the country, hanging out in the capital in Brazzaville, so they were big city slickers. The real forest experts that we wanted to work with, people that had an idea about the plants and the animals and the behaviors occurring in this region, were the Bayaka people, the semi-nomad forest forager people that live in the villages around the Nouabalé-Ndoki National Park. And we weren't the first people to work with these folks. Many of the pictures I know Steve Blake will recognize from the teams that he worked with in the early 1990s. But these people are incredible naturalists. Many of them deserve PhDs in botany and animal behavior because of their extensive interactions with the forest and the wildlife, and we can't thank them enough for their contributions. And they clean up well. We get them into these uniforms, take them out to the forest, and they protect us every day from charging elephants. I can't see a snake in the forest to save my life, and they definitely point these things out, and also have taken a great interest in the chimpanzees and discovering their behavior alongside with us. There's no one you could work with that enjoys the forest more than these people. So what did they show us? David, during his first mission there, this is one of the first times that he was in the Goualougo Triangle, found chimpanzee tools at termite nests that looked very different from what Jane Goodall had seen in Gombe in Tanzania. So instead of just having fishing probes that were made out of herbaceous material, which you can see at the top, there were also these stout sticks made of Thermandursia hensii, for those of you that know the trees in this area, uniformly made of that type of tree. So the chimpanzees seem to be selectively harvesting that type of wood and making these stout sticks. How could you extract a termite from a termite mound with a stout stick? It just didn't make sense. Maybe they were using it to open the nest, or it had some other function. But no one had ever observed these behaviors. The tools had been picked up for decades. There had been papers written about the traces, but no one had actually seen the full behavior be executed. And so this was something, as chimp fanatics, David and I were very interested in discovering. We were also interested in knowing whether the brush at the end of those fishing probes, you can see it's frayed into what looks like the end of a paintbrush, if you will. Each one of these tools had these types of brushes, and so it seemed like it must serve some function. Maybe it was just a byproduct of having been inserted into the nest and the chimpanzees removing the termites, but we didn't think so. We thought maybe this is something that they pre-modified because it was so common and seen on every single tool. And because we were only a small team of people at that time and wanted to be able to observe these behaviors relatively quickly, we partnered with an electrical engineer, and we put out remote video cameras that had passive infrared sensors. And this was a way to increase our time spent in the forest without having to trudge down to these termite nests early in the morning, camp out, maybe even have to build a hide out of vegetation like some of the early chimpanzee researchers had done. We could just set a camera there with a charged battery and leave it for weeks on end, and then it was like Christmas when you showed up to check the tapes to see if any chimpanzees had been present. So we didn't just get one camera. We were really fortunate to work with Brevard Zoo and Columbus Zoo, and they purchased multiple cameras so that we could hedge our bets. So I went out in the forest with these cameras, and we tied them to the different trees and went to go check our tapes to see what we would get. And there's the biodiversity of the Ndoki forest coming out to be seen on camera. Look at me, take my picture. Wonderful things. We have hours and hours of Red River forest hogs and gorillas looking surprised when they see a camera, and even curious leopards. We were fortunate, though. Eventually the chimpanzees did come. They immediately spotted the cameras, and they would sometimes walk up to them. They definitely weren't duped by our camouflaging of these units, but they did have tools, so we were very hopeful. And we got some glimpses like this, which wasn't exactly what I was looking for, but I was still so thrilled to see a chimp with the right type of tools at the right place. Because this is an underground termite nest, so it doesn't look like much, but we think there's termites underneath the soil there. So don't come to the camera. No, 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 the termite nest. Mom is there. Mom has tools. It's not a total disaster, but it's not what we were looking for. No, definitely move away from the camera. That's what chimps do when they have tools. So trying to work on a Ph.D. on chimpanzee tool behavior and activity budgets, this is not going to cut it. And then just to smudge the camera, so there's no chance of getting any clear footage. It's just insult to injury. So these chimpanzees are absolutely curious and also very innovative. And we eventually were able to record the behavior that we were after. So you can see this is Lewis. He has one of those stick tools, and he's pushing it into the ground to make a tunnel into a subterranean termite nest, which is just brilliant. And no one had ever seen this before. So he's creating his own access point. And he has the herbaceous fishing probes in his mouth, ready to follow up after having punctured a tunnel. So he's going to extract the stick, and he's going to smell it to see if he's breached a termite nest. He straightens one of those lovely brushes and starts to insert it into the ground. So we had glimpsed the use of a chimpanzee tool set, which in 1997 there had been a review of all the different types of tool behaviors, and it was said that the use of tool sets was very, very rare. And that's not the case. In Central Africa, they use tools on a regular basis, sometimes daily, to gather termites. And so here we see complex tool use being used on a regular basis, possibly as a response to some of the competition with those gorillas or other animals in the forest, but just wonderful for the study of chimpanzee behavior in this region. We were also able to solve the mystery about the brushes made at the end of the tool with clips like this. So this is Donnie and his sister Malia. He comes up with a stem that had leaves. He strips off some side vegetation, but you'll see after he starts to pull apart the fibers that he actually makes a brush very deliberately, pulling it through the sides of his mouth, using his molars to create that brush. And we analyzed 54 video clips of these chimpanzees arriving with their herbs intact and found that on 52 occasions, indeed, they made the brush well in advance of using it to fish for termites. So it wasn't a byproduct of use. And we were then intrigued to see if this was something that would increase their efficiency in harvesting termites, because this would be evidence of an improved tool design, which is very difficult to find evidence of in other animal taxa. And we couldn't ask the chimpanzees because they made the brush in advance every time. So we had to find some folks that would be willing to fish with a brush tip tool, one that had been made into one of these fine paintbrush ends, and also just a regular fishing probe that wasn't modified. And so we went to our tracking team, the Bayaka trackers, and we said, okay guys, we gotta learn termite fishing. Half of you have brushes and half of you don't. And we compared the results, and the brush tip was actually 10 times more effective in gathering termites. And so, woohoo, the Goualougo chimps again have these amazing cognitive abilities and complex tool-using behaviors that we haven't seen anywhere else in the study of wild chimpanzees, even after 50 years. And another behavior that we observed on a regular basis that had never been attributed to any population of chimpanzees was the use of a single tool for multiple functions. So we've seen a tool set, which is 2 different tools with different functions, but can they take their brush tip tool and generalize it to be used for something else? And in this case, we see Lewis, he flips around the tool to clear an obstruction in a nest. So there's dirt that's fallen in and possibly blocked the tunnel that he was fishing in. So instead of using the brush to gather termites, he flips it around. And it wasn't just Lewis. Here's Teresa. She flips around her probe to clear the obstruction and then uses the brush again, which you have to carefully straighten before throwing it into the nest. And here we will see Maya. She flips around her tool. She clears the obstruction, recognizing that the brush has a different function than the blunt end, threads her brush into the nest to harvest her termites. And we also discovered that there were other types of tool behaviors that were exhibited by this chimpanzee population. In a moment, I'll show you a slide of the different sizes of tool repertoires across chimpanzee study sites. But in this case, we had no idea what we would be looking for because no one had studied chimpanzees in this area. So each time we saw a chimpanzee use an object with a particular goal in mind, we were so excited to discover that it was a tool-using behavior of the Central African chimpanzee. And we found, as I mentioned, the termite fishing with the brush tip tool, the puncturing of termite nests using those Thulmandersia sticks. They also use other tools to open up large elevated nests that are your more traditional termite nests. And that hadn't been documented before. So another tool set, one to open this large nest and then you follow up with your fishing probe again. They leaf sponge like every other chimp population, so that was good to know. That's a chimpanzee universal. But they do unique things like use rain covers. They take leafy branches and cover their backs, which orangutans and bonobos do, but common chimpanzees had not been observed to do at any other site. So that was very exciting. They perform ant dipping, which is seen at Gombe, but in this particular situation, again, they use a tool set. They have a perforating tool that they use to open the nest to prepare it, and they follow that up with a long dipping probe. And the honey pounding behavior, which is extraordinary, and I'll explain that to you more in a moment. But over 20 different types of tool behaviors used in foraging, grooming, covering themselves, sometimes in social interaction or exploration. And we can compare that to the other sites that study wild chimpanzees. So here's Goualougo at the far left end of this graph, and you can see the blue is the different types of tool behaviors. Red are habitual tool-using behaviors, and we just haven't been in Goualougo long enough to observe whether some of these tools are used regularly, so it's probably an underestimate, but we're right up there with the long-term study sites at Tai from the late 70s, Gombe, which has been studying chimpanzees for a long time, and Boso. Some other chimpanzees don't show as much tool diversity, but it seems like there are factors in the Goualougo chimpanzees environment that's promoting their use of multiple different tools to access food items and in other aspects of their lives. And the honey gathering is wonderful and different from other areas. So not to belabor the point, but they use tool sets here too. It's crazy, multiple different types of tools to achieve a particular function. And we found different behaviors that then had been used with single tools or even multiple tools in that they conserve their tools for later use. So here we see Dorothy, who's pounding on the left with a pounding club to get into a beehive. She then sets that tool aside on top of the branch, waiting to use it until later while she breaks off another branch and uses that to lever open the nest. And then finally, in the picture on the right, she's using a dipping tool to extract honey. We've seen them use up to 6 different types of tools in sequence to extract honey. And they have a real sweet tooth. Some of these individuals will go after honey as frequently as 1 time a week, checking different tree hollows, looking to see if there's a sweat bee nest that they can raid. And other chimpanzees use dipping tools, but we hadn't seen behaviors like the pounding that had been described by the local people and also in an early Mike Fay publication of using large clubs to pound open beehives. And now we have lots of video footage of this type of behavior. So this particular pounding club is over 1 kilogram, and this adult female, she has a tiny baby on her chest, notice, is hanging on a tree up to over 3 stories high, trying to pound into this sweat bee nest. And we were able to record video footage of this entire bout. She pounds 1,000 times. That's incredible. I mean, she had to have been exhausted. And she uses multiple tools to try to access the honey, but really only gets probably just a few drops of honey, not big pieces of comb like you might imagine, not the buckets of honey that you would get with regular African honeybees. These are sweat bees, so there's going to be just a very small harvest. And every time I go to Starbucks and I see those little packets of honey that are just for free, I think of this poor female chimp pounding away in the canopy, risking her life for a bit of honey. So the next question we're interested in addressing, and we have a graduate student at Washington University who's going to be following up on this, is how do they learn these tool traditions? How do kids pick up the use of multiple tools and how to make a brush and how to select different types of tools? And we know that chimpanzees in other settings will share tools with their kids. Most of the time it's described as stealing, but in the Goualougo we seem to see a very high frequency of sharing tools. So here's Maya with her brush tip fishing probe, and here comes Malia who's begging, trying to pull it away, a little bit of a hesitant response from Maya, but she sacrifices her fishing probe to her daughter. And this probe has been manufactured with the right materials. It's already been fashioned into a brush. And so Maya has prepared Malia to use the tool at the nest without having to go through all those preparation steps that she can pick up later. Here we have Maya again, and we'll have Malia come up, little tool thief. And we see that Maya is actually going to sacrifice her tool again. And this is a cost. This is a cost to a capable tool user who has to interrupt her fishing bout and find other materials to continue fishing, maybe something less effective. And we see that individuals are willing to do this all the way up to the point where their kids are subadults and capable of making tools. So they really seem to facilitate the tool using behaviors of their children. Again, a more active handoff. In this next clip, we see one of those individuals that's a bit older, as I mentioned. So this individual on the right is very capable of making their own tool, making a brush and finding the appropriate herb, but is wanting to take the tool of its mother, and so standing very close, reaching out, and mother sacrifices the tool. So when we compare these types of tolerant behaviors and tool sharing with the Gombe chimpanzees, we're actually finding that Goualougo chimpanzee mothers are much more tolerant and willing to share their manufactured tools. So this is possibly how the traditions are maintained over time with such fidelity in different contexts. So here we have a mother fishing at a subterranean nest. Her offspring is begging. The other kid just came up and stole her puncturing tool, so she's losing tools left, right, and center. But the youngster here is begging, reaching for the tool, and mother hands it. And so here we see the cost of her having to go off and get another tool. In the meantime, her kids move in and take her sight. But she figures it out. In the next clip, instead of handing off her tool, she's going to split it in half. And so she shares the tool with her offspring without having to go off and find her own tool. That is brilliant. And when I showed this to some of the cognitive psychologists that we worked with at the Max Planck Institute, even they were dumbfounded. How she came up with that solution, that's just wonderful. So all of these amazing behaviors and getting to know individual chimpanzees, we know over 400 individual chimpanzees in the Goualougo study area, it's very heart-wrenching to think about the conservation context in which they live. Not those particular chimpanzees, because their area has been gazetted to be added to the national park, but those other chimpanzees that I mentioned that live on the other side of the rivers, to the east and the west of the Goualougo Triangle. And so this is when we start to move into those regions and try to address some of the conservation threats to those chimpanzees. And as you can see, this is a logging road. When I first arrived in Republic of Congo over 10 years ago, these logging roads weren't active that were up close to the national park. You could drive in and never see a logging truck, go into the study site and come out and kind of be secluded and away from those threats. But now there are active logging trucks on those roads, and we'll see some of that data in a moment. So we have an obligation to address these threats, or at least assist in addressing these threats within the larger community. And it's a threat to the traditions of the chimpanzees. So as the forest ecology changes, those termite nests change. So the fungus-feeding termites that build those beautiful elevated nests like we see in this photo to the right, they change to become more wood-feeding termite species. This has been studied in Cameroon, and so the opportunity to use tools may change. Now, we probably can't stop logging in these areas, we know that, but we can suggest strategies like not knocking down the termites and using them to regenerate other trees. We can ask people to protect those trees, and also potentially the important fruit trees to the chimpanzees and gorillas in those areas. We can possibly reduce the size of roads and the densities of roads. We can close the roads after they're being used so they don't allow access to illegal hunting and so on. So these types of recommendations. And it's not just relevant to Northern Republic of Congo. The entire region where chimpanzees and gorillas live in sympatry, where they live in overlapping forests, is dominated by logging concessions. So in this slide, you see the logging concessions in brown and the protected areas, the national parks, in green. And so if we can develop strategies to help chimpanzees, gorillas, elephants, other animals in those logging concessions, we can have a much larger impact than just studying chimpanzees in the national park. And here's just for reference where we work in Northern Republic of Congo in comparison to that landscape. So here we see Crickette again, and he has been enlisted not just to count chimpanzees and gorillas in the main study area, but now he's moving out into the logging zone with his notebook and interviewing loggers and counting transects, counting nests on transects that cross logging roads and come up on trees that were cut down. And you see machete cuts in the forest, and he meticulously records every single human sign along with every single animal sign. And what we see is that the forest is changing, that the available habitat for chimpanzees and gorillas shifts, and this is what we would predict, but we have detailed documentation of the resource base before and the resource base afterwards. And we can call into play our specialized information about how apes use the forest to make recommendations how we can reduce that impact. So here we see the forest that's to the west of the Goualougo Triangle before logging, and the green highlights the best chimp gorilla habitat there is. And the yellow is pretty good habitat, and red is not such great habitat. This would be a great place for an ape to live. But after logging has moved through, we see that that area changes quite a bit. They lose access to those prime forests, and the chimpanzees concentrate in these particular areas where there's good habitat. But if you know about chimpanzee behavior, you know that they're territorial and they don't like to be compacted into small areas. Gorillas are a bit more flexible, so they can move away from logging teams and into different forests. And also they like some of the lush vegetation that comes up when the canopy gets broken. So you get dense herb undergrowth coming up very quickly after a forest has been logged, which is perfect for gorillas, but not so much for chimpanzees. So we can talk about these different types of effects with empirical observations and approach logging companies with that information. We also found an unanticipated threat to chimpanzees and gorillas in this region when we invited a collaborator from Emory University and the Centers for Disease Control to study the risk of parasite infections. And when we looked at the different types of parasites that were found in the leaf litter in the logging zone and compared that with the national park, we found that there were human-introduced parasites in the logging zone. And these parasites were not found in the pristine forests of the Nouabalé-Ndoki National Park. So 25%, just to give one example, of vegetation plots were infected with Strongyloides stercoralis, which is a human parasite that can have very pathogenic effects. We also found that gorillas in the logging zone had this parasite. So they'd actually contracted it from the leaf litter, most likely, that had been infected by humans passing through the area and not following proper sanitation measures. And this can be avoided. We can make specific recommendations to the logging company about digging the proper types of latrines, also about providing anti-parasite medications, intestinal parasite medications, anti-worming medications to their teams. And it seems to this point that the logging company has been, near the area where we work, has been receptive and open to this type of data collection and empirical observations that show their impacts and how they can be reduced. So in 2007, we wrote an initial idea of guidelines that could reduce the impact of logging on chimpanzees and gorillas in these forests. And now in 2011, we're revising this with our data-driven research that has shown that some of these recommendations should absolutely be followed and how, and others that we can strengthen by our observations. So we can approach different logging companies. The logging company that we work with around the study area has been receptive and is certified by the Forestry Stewardship Council, but other logging companies that may not want to seek such stringent certification could just adopt a few of these. And this could help their public image to be more attractive in that they're trying to reduce their impacts on local wildlife and so on and so forth without having to go through all the steps of certification. There's options of all different types. Some of them don't even have any costs associated with them. Obviously, some are much more labor intensive, but there are others that logging companies could certainly follow with just minor modifications to their regimes. And with logging comes hunting, because you open up access to these remote tracts of forest with logging roads, and also you provide routes for the meat to be transported out to village centers. And it's much easier hunting in these areas where there haven't been villages for a long time. The animals are abundant and so on and so forth. Around villages, they may be depleted. So with logging roads and so on, we see increases in the amount of hunting and also illegal poaching. And we document this as well, as I mentioned. I'm not going to provide too much detailed information on this front, but you can see when we started working in that forest next to the Goualougo Triangle in 2004, this green line indicates human signs. There were none. Some old signs from research teams, but when the logging company arrives, you see that line increase and go to a peak in about 2006, 2007. Now that's when logging was supposed to pull out of the area. It was done. They had harvested the trees. But what we found is the humans didn't leave. Because there were roads, they kept coming in and gathering products and gathering meat and so on and so forth. And so we don't actually see that drop back down to baseline. And this is important information for protection officials to see how much human activity is continuing in the area, and to have teams going in at 6-month intervals like you see on this graph. Our research teams, Crickette, and John Robert, are going into this area and counting nests and human signs to see what's going on in the logging zone after the logging has stopped. And unfortunately, I don't have the 2010 data here, but in 2010, they even found a poached elephant carcass with its tusk removed. So this is something that could have quietly slipped under the radar had there not been continuous intensive monitoring of these forests. As a result of those reports, eco guards and protection officials were deployed, and there has been increased protection efforts in that area. Fortunately, in this area, we see, if you see the red line and the blue line, red being chimpanzee and blue being gorillas, that the encounter rates of these apes remain stable. Here I just have encounter rates, but trust me, the densities are also very stable. So we don't see a huge drop. We don't see that people are hunting chimpanzees or gorillas, or that their populations are drastically declining. Not at least at this point. We have to continue monitoring, because some of the individuals that may be most affected, like the kids who don't yet build nests, could have been affected by the loss of different foods and so on and so forth. We may not see the effects for a long time. Also with reproductive success, if females have lower quality habitats and resources, they just may not produce as many kids in their lifetime. So we're in it for the long haul. We'll keep monitoring these forests as long as people will keep funding us to be there, because we think it's an important endeavor to document the specific effects and also serve as a conservation presence. And then there are the threats that are emerging throughout this region that are a little bit more difficult to counteract with specific strategies. But we have come up with some innovative collaborations and partnerships to try to address the threat of emerging diseases. I've put up a slide here of confirmed Ebola outbreaks. If you're familiar with this particular virus, you know that it has emerged several times in Central Africa, particularly in the Republic of Congo and Gabon in the recent decade. We see several emergences in an area called the Odzala Tridome area, Odzala National Park region on the border of Gabon. And the effects on great apes are dramatic, to say the least. We see mortality rates of 50 to 90% for chimpanzees and gorillas. We know that bats are the reservoir, that chimpanzees and gorillas contract the virus, and that the mortality is just simply devastating for populations. So where you once had 10 gorillas, you now have 1. Researchers studying groups in those regions have gone out to the forest to find their study groups and found only carcasses. Just devastating impacts of this virus in the region. So we're not disease epidemiologists or trained veterinarians, but we love working with them. We've worked with the Global Health Program in the region since the project started in 1999, and our team members have volunteered to be trained in non-invasive carcass sampling because we're out in the forest. Our teams are out in the forest over 360 days a year, and so they're likely to contact ape carcasses in different situations. And they've also volunteered to go into areas where people have found carcasses outside of the national park, for example, or in different areas to collect biological samples, because one of the most difficult issues in addressing this threat is not having information to diagnose what the pathogen was, and also not having information on the natural history of the virus, what context it occurs. So here's a picture of David, and he is sampling a gorilla carcass. So he's suited up as if it's an Ebola-infected individual and collecting samples non-invasively to send to a lab for diagnostic assessment. And here we have myself helping David, and I also like to point out in this slide that in this protocol where you take the utmost precautions to avoid infection in case it is Ebola, you have a dirty person that touches the carcass and has all of the biological specimens, and you have a clean person that uses a bleach sprayer to decontaminate everything. And David is always the dirty person. I'm always the clean person. But we don't just try to collect biological specimens for diagnosing Ebola. We've had the good fortune to work with a wonderful team of international scientists, one of which is Beatrice Hahn, who is studying the prevalence of SIV, simian immunodeficiency virus, and then foamy virus, and most recently the malaria. Plasmodium falciparum in particular was highlighted in a recent Nature article that features the Goualougo Triangle Ape population as being a place where the gorillas are infected with multiple strains of malaria, and also show the strain that is most closely related to Plasmodium falciparum in humans. So the origin of malaria, if you will, is found in these forests in Northern Republic of Congo, and that wasn't known and couldn't have been known without the sample collection of the teams in the forest over long periods of time. The last threat I'm going to mention is that of the lack of educational opportunities for Congolese nationals in this area. And I hadn't realized that until arriving there, that there just aren't good universities. There aren't great options like the kids here have. You don't graduate from high school and think, I'm going to university and it's going to be wonderful and I have the choice of careers. There aren't so many opportunities. So we're now trying to address that. This is the Goualougo Triangle Education Center that we just built in the Nouabalé-Ndoki National Park headquarters, which isn't in the national park. It's outside the national park in a local village. But we have a library facility. It's just the building now. We don't have any books or anything in it, but we're trying to fundraise to buy things to put into the library and also make it a place where we can do educational presentations to the village, taking our scientific results and other information and sharing that with the local population. And we also try to get our guides training in different areas. So John Robert has received a master's degree from Oxford Brookes. I already mentioned Sydney, who pursued botanical studies in Edinburgh, and other training opportunities that arise, travel to international conferences, and different types of things we try to provide to our staff as often as we possibly can. And it's a big team effort. We wouldn't be able to do any of this. I certainly would not be able to without the help of such wonderful counterparts and colleagues, friends and family, if you will. These people are certainly our family in the Republic of Congo, and we can't thank them enough. And we hope to come back someday in a few years and report that we have made more discoveries in the Goualougo Triangle. And Stephanie mentioned that we were fortunate enough to have a National Geographic feature in February 2010, and hope that is just the beginning of a long tradition of chimpanzee research in Central Africa. So with that, I'd like to thank Stephanie for the invitation to come and speak to you this evening. I hope I didn't speak too fast. I wanted to cover a lot of ground. I also owe great debt to Nick Nichols and Ian Nichols for the photos that you saw in this presentation, and all of our wonderful donors, many of which are zoological parks, Columbus Zoo, Brevard Zoo, Lincoln Park Zoo, and most recently the American Zoological Association's Great Ape Tag sponsored our gorilla research in the coming year. We can't thank them enough. And if you'd like to learn more, please go to our website. We have a website, www.congoapes.org. If you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer those. Thank you. Yes.
How does a chimpanzee that is trying to break into a beehive protect itself from stings from bees?
So the question is, how does a chimpanzee who's trying to break into a beehive protect themselves from the stings of the bees? These are sweat bees. They're not honeybees. So we're not having the stings that you would associate typically with bee nests of honeybees. These sweat bees, they're annoying. They go into your ears and your eyes, and sometimes they'll attach to your skin, but they're not going to deliver those types of stings. So just really annoying, but not painful. It's a good question. Yes?
That was really inspiring research. I really enjoyed that. So I actually have a few questions. One thought is, we went to Guayaca, and I have a friend I haven't seen in several years who lived with Louis Carter.
Louis Sarno, is that right? Yes, yes. So you're asking, this gentleman had mentioned the Bayaka people that we work with, and someone that is a musicologist that has worked in this region for many, many years, who Steve Blake knows as well. Louis Sarno, yes, indeed, he is still there, bouncing around. I heard he was making a feature film. I haven't seen it yet. So he's walking back and forth across, visiting Macau, going to Bayanga, and so forth. He's alive and well, doing very well. Oh my goodness, yes, the Bayaka sing in the campfire at night. They make guitars and sing, absolutely. Yes. Yes.
You said that these chimps were very curious. They had not had much human contact. Do we know that the chimps like to be gone when humans first got here? Were they curious too?
That is a good question. So this remark was about the curiosity of these chimpanzees, and that do we know that the chimpanzees at these other study sites like Gombe and Tai and other areas weren't just as naive? I bet they were. There's no reason to think they weren't if they hadn't had human contact. But again, this is a very, very remote region with less than 1 person per square kilometer in Northern Republic of Congo. In the area where we work, we have never encountered any signs of poachers or hunters. There's no villages. Those rivers that I mentioned, the Goualougo and the Ndoki, they're pretty formidable boundaries. Steve knows better than I do, but you definitely have to cross large amounts of swamps. You swim across some of the rivers, and with backpacks, that's very dangerous. So if you can just hunt near your village, people aren't trekking into those particular areas. So I would bet, though, those other chimpanzee populations were probably at one point just as undisturbed. It's a very good point. No, that's a good question. We definitely see distinct morphological features that differentiate the western gorillas from the mountain gorillas. And one of the things I love about these western gorillas is their bright red heads. You see that red patch, and they have shorter hair, and different than the mountain gorillas, probably because of adaptations to the cold habitat that the mountain gorillas have in those higher altitude forests. But I don't know about the hairline, whether that comes down lower in this particular population. But there are people that are studying the physiological features of these gorillas. It's a good question.
Another question I wanted to ask is, we know the human populations with equal intelligence might have more or less complex behavior. Are you finding that with the chimps, depending on where they are you assuming that they're fairly equal intelligence, but there's a question of their culture?
Yeah, I like to make jokes that Congo chimpanzees are smarter than everywhere else. I mean, they're not. They definitely have more sophisticated tool-using capacities or tool-using behaviors, but we have no reason to believe that their cognitive capacities are different across chimpanzee populations. These chimps are responding to their ecological environments in innovative ways. What I think is so intriguing is how it's invented, but then carried on between generations and individuals. So is it that every chimp invented that tool set and then every other tool set after it? I don't think so. I can't invent a tool set. So it has to be some type of social mechanism. And that's very interesting because we don't see such complex behaviors in other areas. We're getting to see these latent abilities in this environment where maybe they have more competition with other animals. That's a really good question, though. But chimps in Congo could be smarter. I'm joking, of course, yes. That's an excellent question. The question is about whether we see tool use in the gorillas in this area. And indeed, it would be wonderful if we did. And we know that gorillas are very capable tool users, as Meg mentioned, in captive environments. So they definitely have the capacities, if you will. But we don't see tool behaviors very often. There's an exception. At Mbeli Bai, they saw a female gorilla who used a stick to test the depth of water before she crossed it. So she detached a stick and she used it to probe in front of her. Now, this is a one-off observation. They also sometimes use snags to cover swamp areas, so they'll push down a limb of a tree that's dead and walk across it. So there are some fleeting observations, but not termite fishing or regular tool use. But that's a very good question. Yes?
You said that this increased tool use in Congo might be due to their social relationships. Do you have one or several theories as to what element of the social relationships might be responsible for this?
This is a wonderful question, and I think you talked so that everyone could hear about the idea that chimpanzees in this particular area have complex tool use, and it could be related to their social relationships. So in East Africa, females aren't so social. They spread off into different core areas, and they're found in very small parties. They don't often associate. And so this would be a limiting factor in social transmission at the horizontal level. So between individuals that are already mature, vertical transmission is going to happen between mother and her kid. But if you don't have aggregations of individuals that are adult capable users, you wouldn't see this behavior passed on between generations. And in Goualougo, we have big fruiting tree resources where sometimes we can have 20-some chimps. Females in general seem to be slightly more sociable than we see in Gombe. I'm just hesitant on that because in West Africa, they're very, very social, and we don't see that degree of sociality between females. So something intermediate between East and West that's allowing this information to flow throughout the social unit. But, I could talk to you about it for hours. I love this stuff.
That's the transmission, but you talk about multiple tools, so I guess it's about generation to creation of more.
So innovation of tool use. This is a good question. I mean, we know that chimpanzees are great innovators. So they innovate behaviors on a regular basis. They experiment with objects and so on. They're great object manipulators. And so there's probably a similar level of innovation between populations. It's just whether it transmits. Yes? Your question was about language skills? We haven't had anyone out in the area to study vocalizations. There's a very active research group at the Bodongo site that's uncovering more complexities about chimpanzee communication than we were previously aware of. Information about the quality and quantity of food resources, about being receptive or thinking about the audience that you're transmitting to in advance of transmitting calls, like whether dominant females are present, and that could have a repercussion if you vocalize that you're mating with a dominant male, something like this. But we haven't had this type of detailed study in our study area yet. Hopefully in the future, that would be a great avenue of research. Yes?
Other studies in tool use include bonobos, similar to what we observed in chimps.
This is a very good question. So the other species of chimpanzee, oftentimes referred to as the pygmy chimpanzee, lives in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We don't see any place where they overlap, but there have been a few reports of the tool-using behaviors of bonobos, and bonobos seem to reside in a very similar habitat. We don't see this type of multiple tool use, so tool sets used to harvest ants or termites. They do use the rain covers during storms. They sponge some things, some pretty rudimentary single tool use, but it is observed. And it seems to be less frequent than chimpanzees. That's a good question. It certainly deserves more research. Unfortunately, the Democratic Republic of Congo is a very difficult place to work due to political turmoil, and researchers have had a hard time just staying in for the long term. So results are slow coming from those areas. It's a really good question. That it? Thank you so much for this opportunity. I appreciate your coming out again.